All right, let's talk about something that pretty much affects everyone, but is, let's be honest, often a bit of a mystery. Estate duty in South Africa. It sounds complicated, I know, but stick with me, because by the end of this, you're going to get exactly how it works. So, what on earth is this so-called death tax anyway?
Yeah, that's what a lot of people call it. And, at its heart, that's basically what it is, a tax that shows up when you pass away. But to really get a handle on it, we need to look at what it officially is and find a much simpler way to think about it.
So the official definition says it's a tax on the transfer of your wealth. But here's the analogy I want you to lock in your mind for this whole explainer. Just think of it as a final toll gate. Before any of your assets can get to your family and loved ones, they have to pass through this checkpoint, where SARS gets to take one last look.
So here's our game plan. We're going to start with that toll gate idea. Then we'll figure out what your estate actually owns. We'll see how we can shrink that value, apply the huge 3.5 million Rand rebate, do the final math, and then wrap up with some really key things you need to remember. Simple, step by step. Let's do it.
Okay, first things first, the final toll gate. Let's just really let that idea sink in. Everything we're about to cover is all about understanding how your estate gets through this one last checkpoint with SARS.
Right. To figure out any tax, you need a starting number. So I want you to imagine a giant funnel. We are going to start at the very widest part, at the top, and we're going to throw in absolutely everything that could possibly be considered part of your estate. You see, the whole calculation is just a process of narrowing things down, moving from the top of the funnel to the bottom. We start with a big number, the gross value. Then we subtract some stuff to get the net value. And then we subtract a bit more to get to the final dutiable amount. That's the number that actually gets taxed. So what gets tossed into the top of that funnel? Well, you've got the obvious stuff. Your house, your car, your investments. But here's the thing that catches so many people by surprise. Something called deemed property. This includes things you might think are totally separate, like a life insurance policy that pays out directly to a beneficiary. You'd think it bypasses the estate, right? Nope. For tax purposes, SARS yanks it right back into the top of that funnel. Okay, so we've got our big, chunky starting number, our gross value. Now the funnel starts to get a little bit narrower. We're applying the first filter, which means we get to start subtracting all the legally allowed deductions to bring that total down. So what can we take out? Well, first, the no-brainers. Any debts you had, like your home loan, plus all the costs of wrapping up the estate, like funeral expenses and the executive's fees. But honestly, the most powerful, the most important deduction of them all is anything you leave to your surviving spouse. And this is a really, really critical point. If you leave assets to your kids, for example, those assets stay inside the funnel. They're part of the calculation. But if you leave those exact same assets to your surviving spouse, they are completely exempt. They get pulled right out of the funnel. This amazing tool has a name, the Section 4Q deduction.
That's right, 100%. The entire portion of your estate that you leave to your spouse gets deducted. It's like it gets a free pass through the toll gate. What it really does is postpone the tax until the second spouse passes away. This is without a doubt a cornerstone of estate planning in South Africa.
Okay, so after we've taken out all those deductions, we hit the next major filter in our funnel. And this one is huge. It acts like a universal safety net that applies to every single estate.
And that number is 3.5 million Rand. Every single person's estate gets this standard deduction. It basically means the first 3.5 million of your estate's value after all the other deductions is completely 100% tax-free. But wait, it gets even better for married couples because of this incredible feature called portability. Think about it. If the first spouse passes away and leaves everything to the survivor, they don't actually use any of their own R3.5 million RM rebate, right? Because of that spousal exemption we just talked about. Well, that entire unused rebate can actually roll over to the second spouse. So what does that mean? It means that when the surviving spouse eventually passes away, their estate could have a massive 7 million Rand rebate. That's their own R3.5 million plus the R3.5 million rolled over from their partner. That is a hugely significant planning tool. All right, we've made it. We've gone through all the filters. We started with that big gross value, we subtracted the deductions, we applied the rebates, and now we are at the very bottom of the funnel. We have our final dutiable amount. So let's put some real numbers on this to see exactly how it works. Let's walk through this together. Say someone passes away with 10 million Rand in assets. First, we take out 500,000 for things like debts and fees. That gets us to a net value of 9.5 million.
Then we apply that standard R3.5 million rebate. And that leaves us with a final dutiable amount of 6 million rand. That is the number that gets taxed.
And the tax rates themselves, they're pretty straightforward. The first 30 million rand of the dutiable amount is taxed at a flat rate of 20%. If it's over 30 million, the amount above that gets taxed at 25%. In our example, our 6 million rand dutiable amount falls squarely into that first 20% bracket. So, the final piece of the puzzle is simple. We take our dutiable amount, that's 6 million rand, and we apply the 20% tax rate. So the final toll is
1.2 million rand. That's it. That's the amount the executor would have to pay to SARS out of the estate before the rest of the assets can go to the heirs. Wow. Seeing the actual number really makes it all feel very real, doesn't it?
Okay, so we have totally nailed the core calculation. But before we wrap this up, let's just quickly cover a few last crucial details that you absolutely need to know. You know, the important fine print.
So who actually writes the check to SARS? Well, the executor is the one responsible for making the payment. But, and this is a big but, the money doesn't always come from the estate's main pot of cash. Remember that life insurance policy we talked about that pays directly to a beneficiary? The tax portion for that asset is actually recovered from the person who received the money. That's a key detail that helps avoid some nasty surprises down the line.
And two final super important points. First, if you're a South African resident, this calculation includes your worldwide assets, not just what you own in SA. Second, there's a very specific order of operations. When someone passes away, it triggers capital gains tax, or CGT. That CGT bill gets calculated first, and it becomes a debt of the estate. And since debts are deductible, it actually reduces the final value before the estate duty is calculated.
And there you have it. We've gone all the way from the top of the funnel right down to the final bill. We've seen how all the deductions and rebates work, and the whole process should be a lot clearer now. Which, of course, leaves us with one final, pretty important question for you to think about. Is your estate ready for its final toll? Thanks for joining me.